section 2, like I talk about the movement continuum.
Yeah.
That's like the term that I think of for it, is that you're just assessing a movement in this sort of spectrum, the sliding scale. And you have to understand the movement from its static positions and then the transitions that are involved from one position to another. So, the squat's a really easy example there. There's the bottom of the squat, and then there's standing, which is the top of a squat. But as you understand those positions, you can work on the positions in many ways, right? And if you're working on the bottom of the squat, well, now you're working on mobility. You're working on someone's range of motion in different ways. But you can do it before it gets too complex, before things are moving around. And then you can actually help people understand the top part of the squat, which would just be standing. Like, how would you want to finish the squat if you had weight, or just how do you want to stand, right? And if you look at those two positions, like, that's fair game for anybody. You can have someone work on standing, and you can have somebody work on some version of a supported squat. Maybe it's just sitting in a lower chair and engaging their body in a way that would be like ready to stand up, right? But that's safe for anybody. And then you go through a continuum of how would you transition from one position to the other, right? Well, maybe I elevate the seat so it's not a very low range of motion, and I just work on sitting down slowly without collapsing, like, which would just be an eccentric component. Well, or maybe I just work on, I'm sitting, can I just stand up slowly without losing my posture, right? And that's something you can teach people, but that's safe for just about anybody, right? So there is a component of every movement that someone's ready for. You just have to like assess what that is as quickly as you can. And just because somebody like isn't getting there from a standpoint is just they don't want that complexity, like, you can still adjust and give the client what they want. It doesn't make it less important. It just, sometimes you have to just compromise with, what someone's coming in, what they want. But I mean, I think it's important not to force your ideas, but also understand that, all right, like, I'm going to try and I'm hitting a wall there, then I'll just veer, because you should as a movement professional have enough versatility to say, I can go the mode of being the teacher, but I could also go the mode of being just the programmer. I'm just going to program a workout for you, things I know that are safe for you, and go nuts. Get what you want out of it, right? But even that, you have to know what someone's ready for, right? Like, you have to be able to separate out the things that, like, they're nowhere near going to hurt themselves with, from the stuff that needs a little bit more, time and teaching.
Okay. No matter what the situation is, there's always a path to push some baseline.
Right.
And
improve. And the idea of variability does not have to be complex either, though. So, I mean, learning new movements is, it's like a slightly different conversation, but if you just want someone to get a workout in, I mean, all directions have an easy movement to do for someone. Like, just having someone do sidestepping, is, just getting someone changing directions, using different muscles, having people just be in different positions, like having some exercises on the back, having some exercises on the side, having some exercises on hands and knees, having some exercises in kneeling, right? It's just, that's a way to vary things up and, not have to really be too complex with it.
So just to recap about variability and your message there, so it's two-part. One, that if I understand correctly, with incorporating more movement variability comes more movement options, like in almost all aspects of life, and also specific environments like golf or a different sport.
Mm-hmm.
But also, you focused a lot on what happens when we, like in your practice as a movement practitioner, you end up focusing a lot on what happens when we specialize and those overuse injuries.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it goes hand in hand, and you have to really understand intent, right? Like, so I don't want to tell an athlete to specialize in their sport less when that's like a big part of what they do. But it might not be a longevity goal, it might be a sport goal, right? It might not be a durability goal either, because, like by nature, the better you are at sport, probably the shorter, if that's your career, it's a short career, even if you have a long career in the sport, right? Like there's not many professional athletes that play past 40 years old. Well, you still got the average person has another 20, 30 years that they would normally be working, right? So, and you still got to be able to figure out how to move and be healthy for the next, several years of your life, several decades, right?
Yeah.
So it's just, you have to separate out those goals, right? Like sport goals are not health goals. Sometimes they, intersect, but it's not the intention is never the same. So if I'm working with an athlete, I'm often balancing out what they're doing too much of in their sport, right? Because I'm not their coach to get them better at their sport, right? That's their coach's job. I'm just trying to like put out fires in many ways and just make sure that they have, a balanced, plan that can work on the attributes that they're not getting naturally from their sport. And most of the time it's certainly not like a form of conditioning that is making them work harder, because if you're a serious athlete, you're getting so much work just with practice and just working on your sport. So you almost have to be the person that monitors their effort, that they're not doing too much a lot of times, and then hit where they're not hitting at all. Whether it's, strength training, whether it's, just certain, angles that they don't get, certain muscles that they don't use, right? Like trying to balance the books for them without taking away what they need to be good at their sport, right? So it's actually pretty tricky to work with athletes. I think it's easier to work with the general population because you can have a little bit more freedom to explore, right? With an athlete, you don't want to be as exploratory sometimes, because they have like a specific set of skills that that you want to try to hone. And like even the natural asymmetries that you see in athletes, you don't want to try to mess with those too much sometimes. So I find myself much more restricted in programming when I work with good athletes than when I work with just even like someone who's 60 plus, the average population. Now the intensity will be able to be higher for the athlete, but the amount of movements to explore, I think, is less for the athlete a lot of times. See is that there's a marketing bias towards people that work with athletes, or towards fitness connected to athletics, where it's like, I want to do what like this athlete is doing, or I want to have like a routine that gets me to look like this athlete. And it's important to separate the difference. And even the people that have like the biggest following in the fitness industry, they tend to have some connection to professional sports, because it's big business. It's very noticeable, right? But it's also not generalizable to the rest of the population, right? So the better you are at working with athletes and higher level athletes doesn't make you better at working with the general population. In some ways,
Sure.
It's its own specialization that might limit your versatility at working with the general population. So just important to know the difference there.
Yeah. There's not a full understanding of how me specializing in the sport is going to affect my life in the future, or make it difficult for me to do something. Is that a conversation you have with athletes?
Rarely, actually. I mean, it's out there, right? Like there's a lot of people that talk about it. I think people that work with athletes more frequently than I do would maybe be more activists for that type of discussion. But again, I just try to like meet the athlete where they currently are, right? So if I'm working with someone and they're about to go to college on a Division I scholarship, I'm not going to talk about like be careful, right? It's not really like my job there. I don't think it is.
Okay.
If somebody's getting constantly injured over and over again, it's I can have a say in that. Like their parents might ask me my advice, but I will rarely say like give up the sport that you love to do. Now, I think there's some rare cases where you see that the parents are pushing for things more than the athlete, and I think that's something that it's a slippery slope to address, but it would be worth addressing in some ways. But I haven't had much experience with that. Like I think a lot of times injuries will be the thing that tells somebody that they either can't move on in the sport because they specialize too much. But in the grand scheme of things, like from a health perspective, like not being able to play a sport the way that you hoped, like because of injury, is not the same thing as when you get older and you have no ability to like get up and down off a chair, get up and down from the ground, like the attributes that you would lose that would lead to like increased mortality or things like that. So I just think they're different conversations. And I don't look at it as a major health thing. I think it's some people are misguided in thinking that, well, I have to specialize early or I'll have no chance of being at the top of certain sports. And I think that's actually pretty rare. Like only a few sports really that there's any evidence that that's true. Like sports that are more versatile, it actually is better to not specialize early so you can build a more versatile athletic background. And you can also see as you grow, like what your attributes fit towards, right? So imagine you make a decision on a sport when you're like 4 or 5 years old, or your parents do for you, right? And you make a decision on something like basketball, right? I'm going to be a basketball star at age 5, and you grow to be 5'10". Well, that's a bad sport to choose, right? Like you might have worked so hard that you somehow can make it, but from a statistics standpoint, you've given yourself it's a bad idea, right? Like so if you just dabble in many sports, you can see like what your body type fits towards, what your attribute fits towards, and then you have built this athletic versatility, and then you can start to specialize later. And I think that's my opinion on it. I've read some things that say that that's more true than not. But like a sport like golf or things like chess or like gymnastics, where like you're peaking at 16, right? Like that you kind of have to specialize a little bit earlier for. And I'm not going to get in anyone's way if they've done that, right? If they're going through that process. If I see abuse, which I've never seen in my career, luckily, then I would have to report that in some way, but I just haven't seen it. I grew up, my dad was a basketball coach, high school basketball coach. So I feel like I understand that world and how that could be something like, you don't want to take that away from a kid. You know what I mean? They may regret some things later, but it's important, right? So I want to just try to do what I can do to keep them, moving forward, right? And I'm certainly not going to, like, parenting is complex, right? So I'm not going to like put my nose in and say like, oh, you should be treating your child this way or that. Again, unless I see something that would cross the line from an abuse standpoint, I have to handle that a different way. But I've never had that experience, luckily.
Good. In this conversation. So you mentioned that there are a few there is research out there that kind of assesses movement variability throughout the day. Not sure I'm fully clear on that, but from what I understood, were you saying that like studying markers like speed, like maybe walking speed or the speed of any activity would be a good indicator of like a person's movement variability or the quality of their movement in general?
Well, what I'm saying is like the way I wrote that chapter, right? The way that I was trying to indicate those different things that we might not be getting in our culture, right? There are studies that look at those individual things that if we got like more of those, perhaps, again, and it's not a causation thing, but it would be an association, right? Like it's good for longevity to be able to move fast later in life still, right? To not lose strength, right? And then from a training perspective, it's like, well, what are the ways that you maintain that safely as you might be losing some other attributes, as you go. So, and I think a piece of it, and it's, there's certainly some of my own personal opinion in there, that we don't get it because we don't need to do it, right? It's sort of like a use it or lose it thing. And it's not because people aren't being active. It's because they're just not looking at like the attributes that they're not touching upon in their activity routines, right? So and if you use the term variability as just like this broad concept, it just starts to make you think about looking at the things that you're not getting more than doing more of what you're already getting, right? So the research, though, does demonstrate these individual things, right, that we're not getting are important for longevity.
Individual aspects of variability.
Of what, yeah, and that's, I listed those things that we're talking about, like pressure and and speed and muscle tension and all of those things. So, and I actually quote some studies like later on when I talk about the individual movements. Like, so I talk about the importance of power and strength, and that would fit in the muscle tension category and things like that. And then I think the idea of like having to get up and down off the ground in different ways, which I have a whole chapter on and talk about some of the research there, I think that fits into the multiple directions idea of variability, because there's different ways to get up, but there's also different directions that you can move to get up, right? As stands right now, it's like more movement's good, cardiovascular exercise is good, right? And that seems to have like the most robust evidence behind it, right? And then there's like guidelines for getting a certain amount at a certain intensity, but that doesn't ever take into account of like how people are moving, right? That just takes into account how much they're moving and at like what intensity. So you can compare, like I was mentioning before, the idea of treadmill training versus circuit training that combines several different movements with the connection between the two being that you're trying to keep the same heart rate. And do you get the same results from a cardiovascular health standpoint, right? Like that would be something that probably be easy to look at. Maybe it has been. Like I haven't really done the research on looking, is there comparisons between like single mode aerobic training versus circuit training. Like I'm sure that's out there. I wouldn't be able to quote that off the top of my head, but that would be something to look at, which would connect more to what I'm talking about.
Then if you're comparing barefoot versus conventional shoe runners, would you say that there's less variability, like that the shoe removes some of the variability, like in the response?
Yeah, I think it's minimal actually in the example there, specifically with running. I think that there's definitely a difference between how your body responds to running barefoot versus running in shoes, but I don't think variability is the best way, like more variability or less variability is the best way to look at that. I just think that it's different. So that's why I'm not trying to look at the idea of like barefoot is better for variability and, more supportive shoes are worse for it. It's looking at it as like, what is the thing that you're doing the most, and do a little less of that, right? Vary it up, right? Because you're missing something when you don't, right? So I think it makes sense that just in daily life, if you are able to tolerate being barefoot more frequently than somebody else, that's a demonstration of more resilience, right? That you can tolerate that. Like if you can tolerate running barefoot and you don't break down, you don't have injuries, like then you're definitely, I think, in a better place than someone who has to layer up with like the most supportive shoes possible. But then it depends on like just how much you're actually running and all of those things, right? So if you don't need as much support, your body's more resilient. Like I think that's something that's kind of easier to see, but that doesn't necessarily link to long life. It's just looking at it as like, if you're not ever looking at anything except the things that you're doing on a regular basis, then that's going to be the stuff that you're not doing is going to be the stuff that you lose, based on the principle of sort of use it or lose it and atrophy that we know exists in the body. All right. So to me, it's like more of a practical statement to look at variability. And then there's the specific things I'm telling people to look at varying that they have been studied. And I do touch on that. So, and there's probably more, I'm sure there's more that I left out. But I think speed and strength, they're definitely in the evidence. When you look at how variability plays into that functionally, though, right? If you just do things that you're comfortable with, eventually your body just starts to adapt to that. So you're actually not going to get much stronger unless you progressively do something different, right? Like, so progressive overload, you have to change it up at a certain point, or your body doesn't actually progress with anything, right? So that's just one piece of variability there. And there's a surprising amount of people that aren't savvy with fitness that work out regularly and they just never change anything. Like, they've been doing the same weights for years, and they have an idea that, like, just because they're holding weights, they're getting stronger, right? Like, so there's a huge education that needs to come with, like, just the concept of how you promote strength, how you promote power, how you promote speed, how you promote endurance, right? Like, and I think that's just not part of the education process for a lot of people. And if you just look at numbers that say, like, you just got to get like 150 minutes of moderate intensity exercise a week, that doesn't give you a lot of information, right?
Right.
So that's what my intention with the book was to connect several things. And in that first section, it was, I talked about positive psychology. I talked a bit about nutrition. When I was broadly talking about movement, my opinion and my experience shows me how important versatility and variability is when I look at overuse injury and I look at the things that people lose as they get older, which is a big part of the population I've seen for years. But it's not so much that people are lazy or they're inactive, right? So I wanted to try to make that distinction. And I also wanted to try to make some distinctions that it's not this like binary good or bad, right? Like, don't do these movements, do these movements. I was trying to say, like, if you're going to spend time doing these movements, here's why, based on the evidence. But that, like, anyone can do any movement they want as long as they have this idea of this continuum of knowing what they're ready for,